The podcast you're about to listen to may contain random lines from musical theater, terrible attempts at regional accents, and a sincere discussion about mental health. You have been warned. Are you ready to start singing with your feet? Formidable! Allez, c'est parti! Non, nous ne sommes pas fous, nous ne sommes pas ivres, nous sommes juste dans la joie. Une joie profonde, nos cœurs elle inonde. Cette joie, elle vient du ciel. Non, nous ne sommes pas fous.
Welcome to Sing With Your Feet, the podcast in which we take joy very, very seriously. The podcast in which we rediscover what brings us joy and make space for it in our lives. The podcast in which our Twitter algorithm reveals our deepest, darkest secrets. My name is Lily Fields, and I'm going to be your fairy godmother for the next half hour or so. This week's podcast, which is episode number 27, is going to be our last until September. That's right, your fairy godmother is taking a little summer break to be with her scalawags and her indulgent Prince Charming while they are all out of school. I'll be honest, I didn't expect it to be so difficult to decide to take the summer off. It's one of those decisions I had to make according to the checklist I shared with you back in episode 23 about making wise decisions. Like, under what circumstances will I regret making this decision? And what part of my ideal life is this decision feeding? And which part of my ideal life will suffer by making this decision? Sharing this time with you each week is something I enjoy very much. And I'll admit it, I'm gonna miss you. But the truth is that the ideal life circles of parenting and marriage are the predominant ones I need to focus on this summer. So, there we go. You'll definitely want to follow the podcast's Instagram, that's at Sing With Your Feet this summer, because I'm planning to give you a few ideal life reminders now and again. Lyella Kelly, your wicked stepsister, is hard at work on her own podcast, a mini-cast called Death Becomes Her, which you can find on all your podcatchers. If you need a summer dose of your wicked stepsister, she'll only be a few clicks away. All right, now that we've done a little bit of housekeeping, Cinderella, let's get down to business. Let's talk about passion. Would you believe me if I told you that the origin of the word passion in Greek is the word to suffer? This actually might not surprise you because last week, in our discussion of relationships and duty, I mentioned that compassion is love in action. It literally means to suffer with. I love this idea that passion is suffering because, well, it just hits right in a very, very fairy godmotherish kind of way. I want to throw a little quote at you here because I think it sets the stage for everything else we're going to say this episode. It's from Albert Einstein, who said, "I have no special talents. I am just passionately curious." Before I started uncovering the fairy dust in my everyday life and digging up treasure that was hidden in my own backyard, and most importantly, before I learned how to set boundaries and limits in my relationships, I would suffer for a lack of time to do the things that made me feel alive. Do you remember how last week I told you that before I undertook to learn how to love myself, I used to hand over a permanent marker to everyone I knew, and I let them fill in my calendar for me? Well, they filled it with lots and lots of time-consuming projects that were not necessarily things I wanted to do. Well, once I learned how to set limits and learned how to say no, I had more time to do the things I love to do. Just to head off what you're about to say, Cinderella, because I know what you're about to say, because I can read your mind. But yes, Lily, I have small children. I can't just say no to everything. I did not learn how to set limits until after the addition of those time-consuming little creatures that I call my children. So it is possible. As a matter of fact, it might even be because I had those little creatures that I learned how to finally say no. To be honest, my children were the first people in my life I have ever been able to systematically say no to and not feel guilty for it. Pre-children, I used to feel guilty for using my time to do the things I loved. I used to feel like I owed my time and talents to others for some existential reason, and that I didn't have the right to use my time the way I wanted to use it. So I would daydream. I would fantasize. I would suffer from longing for the day that I could actually do what it was that I wanted to do. And then one day it hit me. If I didn't prioritize my own joy, no one else would ever do it for me. So I started taking passion way more seriously. And to take a page from Albert Einstein, it didn't require any special talent to make this shift. It just required passionate curiosity. Curiosity, first and foremost, about myself and why I didn't know how to prioritize my own joy. Secondly, curiosity about those little silvery threads of joy that still were there, jumbled up in my heart from a lifetime of disuse. And thirdly, curiosity about the world and how things worked. Now, I will admit that I had, in the process, one very important partner in crime. And I'm going to be careful to not project the totality of my experience onto you for this very reason. My partner in crime was my husband, Prince Charming Fields, who is not called my indulgent husband for nothing. He's always put up with my busy schedule and has long been willing to shoulder a bunch of responsibilities around our house so that I could sneak away to attend to my commitments. But in spite of his collusion to help me get out of the house, there was still a problem. I was committed to a lot of things, yes, but I wasn't committed to things that made me feel alive. I was committed to a myriad of activities that people asked me to do and that I agreed to do because I feel like I owed everything to everyone. So I was busy. I was being super helpful to a lot of people, but I was not experiencing joy. All in all, once I was able to start shifting how I made my commitments, my husband's experience of my busyness barely changed, except for one small thing. I complained a heck of a lot less about my commitments than I used to. That is one benefit of pursuing our passions. We complain a lot less, and we suffer a lot less. In my ideal life, I am a person who. It's been a very long time since we've talked about how awesome it is to be alive. There is a reason for that, of course. In the early days of our podcast, I gave you a bunch of homework to do to help you start defining your ideal life. First, there was the prompt that said, "In my ideal life, I am a person who." You were to finish that sentence as many times as you possibly could to start getting an idea of how all the different parts of your life were interconnected. Then, I suggested that you list out a good memory for each of the first 18 years of your life and describe the circumstances of the most memorable or the most pleasant of those 18. It was a way to pull out the silvery threads that once brought us joy. We talked about how those activities might just be ones that could still bring us joy if we were able to bring them into our lives in small doses appropriate to our current circumstances. That is the focus of the passions circle of our ideal life. Just for a quick digression, the third element that we talked about in the early episodes of the podcast was virtue, and how those noble characteristics that we want to be remembered for after we die, they can become like the edge pieces on the puzzles of our life, which make it so much easier to make decisions and to do hard things. This summer, while you are waiting for your fairy godmother and wicked stepsister to come back from their hiatus, I highly recommend you go back and listen to the first 10 or so episodes as a refresher. They might actually hit a bit differently now that we've taken a deeper dive into our ideal life themes. Today, we're talking about passions, those silvery threads that look a heck of a lot like joy, actively pursuing, teasing out those threads and giving them a try again is a much ignored part of self-care. We aren't talking about becoming a professional race car driver or climbing Mount Everest or winning a Tony Award. We are talking about seeking out and taking advantage of opportunities to try those things that we've always been interested in. You like to drive fast? You like to climb mountains? You like to perform on stage? Passions are those things that we know will increase our happiness, even in tiny doses. They are things that make us feel alive and things that we are willing to take risks for. Let's pick apart those definitions, shall we? Just before we do, peruse your ideal life statements. Look for the ones that connect back to those silvery threads to the activities we enjoyed as children, or those things that we wish we could do more often. At this part in the podcast, I usually share my "in my ideal life, I am a person who" statements to help dislodge some different ideas for you. But in this one area, I don't want to influence you, or I don't want to make you think that your passions are not valid. Whatever makes you feel alive is valid. Whatever you are willing to take a risk for is valid. So, my first definition of passions are things that, in the absence of which, we suffer a little bit. My second definition of passions is things that make us feel alive. For you, it might be hiking or cooking or meditating. For me, it's making music and it's textiles. My sister Poppy loves to travel. I have a very dear friend who loves animals and who spends every possible moment with them. My father-in-law is passionate about naval warships. Whatever your passion is, it reliably brings you joy. Now, I want to address something here because a listener once brought it up, and I want to be very, very sensitive to those of you who might be hearing me wax passionately about passions, but just aren't feeling it. I am not a mental health professional, so keep that in mind. I know that there are people who struggle to complete the exercise about good memories for the first 18 years of their lives because they suffered very difficult childhoods. There are also people who are anhedonic, people who have no experience of joy or pleasure at all, and it is often related to childhood trauma. Another problem might be a generalized lack of interest or inability to get excited about anything, and it's this thing that sneaks up on us in the form of depression or simply a less passionate season of our life. This can happen to all of us from time to time. This apathy, it might not be long-lived, or it might last for years. In either case, whether you have never felt like you've had a passion in your life, or if you've had a passion and you've lost it, then perhaps you need some professional help. A counselor, a therapist, a psychologist who could help you navigate this. Please, 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 please get help. After that lengthy but important parenthesis, we were talking about our passions being the activities that make us feel alive. It can be a pastime, a hobby. It can be something that we do completely alone or something that we do with others. But I'm going to suggest here that, for example, playing solitaire on your computer is not going to meet the bar for a passion, according to your fairy godmother. Sure, it's a pastime. It might even be a hobby. But on the other hand, I will say perhaps that a video game might be a passion. Why now, Lily Fields, you are talking out of both sides of your mouth. But my dear, I am not. Because the last subpart of the making us feel alive definition is that it's something that connects us to others or to the natural world. Now, this definition actually is more inclusive than it sounds at first blush. I would argue, for example, that someone who does an activity entirely alone, like making jewelry out of, bottle caps, well, that there is still some connection. I mean, people wear jewelry. There is a tenuous possibility that the making of this jewelry will bring that person into contact with other people. So either in the obtaining of the bottle caps or the giving away of the jewelry, it connects us back to other people. Plus, theoretically, by recycling bottle caps, we're keeping them out of landfills. So in that way, we're connecting to nature, too. But solitaire doesn't connect us to other people. Video games might connect us to other people with a network of video gamers, for example. The point is that passions are most delicious when they are something that are shared or in some way connect us to other people or with nature. It's one of the tenets of the philosopher princess theory on life and happiness. Connection is happiness. Believe me, we've done well to leave her alone in her ivory tower this season. Once she wakes up and starts saying annoying things like, "Virtue is a tone reward," we'll all be wishing that she'd just go back to sleep. All right, how did I get quoting that woman again? Yes, I was talking about solitaire. Sorry, that was a really long digression. My third definition of passions is the things that we are willing to take risks for. Here I go. I'm going to tell a story, so settle in, buckle up. My mother taught me to knit more than 20 years ago. I found it so relaxing. After making a lot of scarves to master various stitches and techniques, I branched out. I still have my first knit item of clothing. It was a pale blue mohair sleeveless sweater, which I still wear, thank you very much. That blue mohair yarn came from a monastery in a teeny tiny village in southeastern France. It was a gift from my mother-in-law, who knew I loved to knit. It turned out that the monks at this monastery raised the animals themselves. They sheared the animals themselves, and they prepared the wool themselves. They dyed the wool themselves, and they spun the wool themselves. For the 20-some years since I discovered that little monastery in a teeny tiny village in southeastern France, I have found the idea of wool production absolutely fascinating. When we moved to northeastern France in 2007, I befriended someone who has a gigantic family. Both her parents are from immense families. Her mother and several of her aunts had maintained some of the old traditions of wool preparation and spinning, and of course, knitting. One of her aunts still had an old spinning wheel, although due to bad health, it went unused. I will not hide from you that when I first heard about this aunt and her spinning wheel, my curiosity was piqued. But I wasn't courageous enough, and I didn't love or trust myself enough at the time to take a risk and ask her to teach me. And it's something I would live to regret. Several years passed, and the conversation about wool came up with another friend who mentioned that they owned some property on which they kept sheep. She asked if I would like to take the wool and try to figure out how to spin it. So I did. I MacGyvered a little top whirl drop spindle out of the lid of a pickle jar, a dowel rod, and a random little hook, and some washi tape. Oh, I learned how to spin. I learned how to do it badly, but I did it. I made a jacket out of that hand-spun wool, which I wore and still wear. I am so proud to wear it. Well, then COVID. And then we lost that lovely old woman of the unused spinning wheel, and along with her, all of her knowledge and her skill. However, my friend's mother thought of me when they were emptying the house and asked if I would be interested in keeping the spinning wheel. So what do you think I said? Yes, please. So now I had a spinning wheel, but no more wool. The spinning wheel sat there for a long time. And that is where The Little Prince and a theme park that I go to with my boys nearly every weekend comes into play. You've heard of Le Petit Prince by the author Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Well, go back to listen to episode 14 called Know Thyself, in which my indulgent philosopher husband makes an appearance. He quotes Saint-Exupéry, and I remember it was quite lovely. Long story longer, one of the first things the Little Prince does in this poetic little book called Le Petit Prince is to ask the narrator to draw him a sheep. And the narrator sums up his whole tale by saying, I know that the Little Prince existed because he was charming, he laughed, and he wanted a sheep. If anyone wants a sheep, it is proof that he exists. I know, you should really read The Little Prince. It's full of poetic little gems like that one. This little theme park has an entire petting zoo themed around sheep and pigeons because, well, it was with a flock of migrating birds that the Little Prince embarked on his adventure around the universe. Last summer, every single time we would go to this theme park, which we do very often, like I said, I would say to my eldest scalawag, I wonder what they do with all that wool. Because there are like 40 sheep and maybe a dozen different breeds with all this gorgeous varied wool, and I was creatively drooling every time I would see them. Finally, my son said to me after about the 30th time I'd said it, he said, why don't you just ask them? Now, let's step out of the story for a second to introduce a very important point about the essence of passion. Passion is something you are willing to take risks for. It's something you are willing to step out of your comfort zone for. Now, you know me well enough by now. I don't like to step out of my comfort zone. I don't like to talk to strangers. Staying safe, though, is a surefire way to live a boring, passionless life. My son was right, of course. For all the times I had wondered about the wool and secretly imagined spinning up a lovely coat from some of those long locks, the only thing keeping me from an answer was my inability to talk to strangers. If I could just ask someone, I would have an answer. I know how small this all sounds, but I still remember the moment at which my interest in wool went from being a pastime or just a hobby to becoming a passion. It happened the very moment I was willing to take a risk and to talk to a person I didn't know. "Excusez-moi," I said to the person who cares for the animals. "What do you do with the wool after you shear the sheep?" He gave me a kind of strange look, and I assumed he was sizing me up as just one of those weirdos who ask stupid questions about the animals at his park. "Nothing," he said. "Do you want it?" He might have been joking, but my son, who knows me, immediately cut in and answered for me, "Yes, she wants all of it." And with that, my passion was solidified. Indeed, the person who takes care of the animals at the park would have been very happy to see the wool go somewhere other than just the trash. He was interested in what I would do with the wool, and I insisted on telling him that I was a novice, but that I had a spinning wheel, and that the only thing I was lacking right then was wool to use on it. So we exchanged numbers, and he promised to give me a call when the shearing was done in the late springtime. So after many months of waiting and looking at that spinning wheel, just daydreaming about when I was finally going to get to use it, I got a text message. I got it about a month and a half ago, telling me that the wool was ready for me. I received about 100 pounds of wool, which is only half of what he could have given me. But I have a little bit of a storage problem in our current configuration. But for the last month or so, I have been passionately, literally reinventing the wheel, figuring out how to wash, card, spin, felt. I've always loved wool, but it became a passion worth my time and energy when I realized that what I was willing to take a risk and get out of my comfort zone for to make this happen. Incidentally, this passion does pass the connection test as well. It connects me back to nature with wool and the beauty of the natural fibers. It connects me to history because this is an ancient art. And it connects me to others because I'm developing a project with my children's school to teach them about wool and the history and the art and science of wool. And I'm making little gifts out of the wool for all the people I love, because there is literally nothing more poetic than making a rose out of the wool from the little prince's sheep. Okay, that was a very long story, but the point is this. There are activities you might love, but that don't qualify as passions because you wouldn't necessarily sacrifice your comfort for it. Passions are what we are willing to sacrifice for, take risks for. And to take us back to the original Greek definition of passion, passions are activities we are willing to suffer for.
Elle me fait bondir et vibrer, crier. Elle me donne envie de chanter, danser. Elle pousse à agir, donner, partager. Et tout simplement de sourire, aimer.
Layala Kelly, Death Doula and Your Wicked Stepsister, is here to share with you a slightly wayward story about someone who wants to express their passions even in death. You'll see, Layala will douse out the fires of those passions pretty quickly. Layala, the floor is yours.
As you know, I'm a bit wicked, a bit deathy. What you may not know is that Lily, your fairy godmother, is getting deathier and deathier with each passing day. I know this because she sends me a variety of oddities that are right up my alley. I take it as a compliment. My deathy enthusiasm appears to be infectious. It seems that recently, Lily was perusing the D&D chats. For those of you who weren't young in the 80s or didn't watch Stranger Things, D&D is short for Dungeons and Dragons. Why Lily is spying on the D&D crowd, I don't know. Maybe she's a closet dungeon master in petticoats. Maybe that's her secret wild card. At any rate, Lily sent me a letter that was on a D&D chat. It was written by a 36-year-old woman about her husband's end-of-life plans. She writes, "My husband of 12 years has had some medical problems recently. The topic about end-of-life plans came up, and I asked if he wanted to be buried. He didn't want that, nor did he want to be cremated. My husband wants me to have his skull taken from his body and cleaned. Then he wants that skull put on the mantelpiece in the living room. The rest of the body he wants sent to one of those places that makes the gems out of bodies and made into 2 blue diamonds. He then wants the gems to be put in the eye sockets of the skull to look like his eyes. Then he can, quote, watch the family home and be passed down through the generations. So, here's the question. Is this possible? Let's examine the elements. First, upon his death, he would like his head removed from his body and cleaned. Okay, who is going to do this? Well, I can tell you it's not going to be the death doula or the doctor or the family. The best hope is going to be the mortician, and I'm guessing that's going to be a bit of a tough sell. Morticians do provide death care, and while you could make an argument that embalming is a bit invasive, it's nothing like getting out a hacksaw and removing the head from a corpse. I have, however, read about a woman whose job it is to do just that. There is a fascinating book called Stiff: The Curious Life of Human Cadavers. In the very first chapter, we learn about Yvonne and her exceptionally unique job. Yvonne is the lab manager and resident cadaver beheader in a lab where surgeons practice surgical procedures like facelifts. Since donated bodies are very valuable, you don't use a whole body to practice a rhinoplasty. Instead, heads are separated from the rest of the body. The heads can be used by the plastic surgeons, and the rest of the body can be used for other purposes. I'm guessing that getting a private audience with Yvonne isn't going to be an easy task. So she may not be available to help with our, let's call it a legacy project. Here's another problem. Even if the mortician or the decapitation specialist, I don't think that's her real title, but she does really deserve a special title. Even if one of them was game to segment the body, most states have laws pertaining to abuse of a corpse. I can't imagine that a funeral home would love the optics of being associated with corpse abuse or the legal implications. But let's say your legacy project has passed that first hurdle and you need to have the skull defleshed. I live in Montana, and defleshing skulls isn't as uncommon as you may think. Skulls of one sort or another are frequently used in Western art. Bison skulls, elk skulls, cow skulls. There are plenty of people familiar with the process. However, once again, those pesky abuse of corpse laws could make it difficult to find someone willing to do the procedure on a human skull. But for the sake of argument, we will assume that the creepy crawly bugs have done their part of the job and that the skull has been boiled and you now have a nice, clean, defleshed skull. Okay, back to the now headless body. The body needs to be cremated. Easy enough. The cremains, which is the fancy name for the ashes, will contain carbon. When the cremation is complete, you'll need to send about 1 cup of the cremains to one of the companies that can turn the carbon into a diamond. There are several companies, but there's a company called Eterniva which offers this service. I chose them because they make the largest carat of diamonds. So they will make a 3-carat blue diamond for $50,000. You're going to need 2 for this project, so that's $100,000. 3-carat diamonds are certainly substantial on your hand, but we really need a stone that is more comparable to the size of an eyeball. A 100-carat stone is about the size of a lollipop. Still a bit small to fill the eye socket of a skull, but since this is getting pretty pricey, we may have to budget on this one. So we're going to settle for the 100-carat eyes. So ultimately, our grand total is going to come to millions of dollars and a few broken laws. But you will have a skull that would be a valuable family heirloom. Oh, and one more tiny little aside. It's not technically legal to keep a person's skull, but perhaps with the expressed wishes of the deceased, gone through the court, maybe you could get a court judgment in your favor. So let's add a few extra legal fees and court costs just to cover that. Lily, I hope that answers your question. Before I leave today, I want to thank you, the listener, for your enthusiastic support of The Wicked Stepsister. I so appreciate the warm reception. This episode marks the end of season 1. But if you are interested in continuing our death chat, you can find me on my own mini-cast called Death Becomes Her. I hope to catch up with you there. And last but certainly not least, a great big merci beaucoup to Lily for sharing the floor with me. Au revoir.
Well, thank you, Lila, for outing me. Honestly, the Twitter algorithm has completely misunderstood me, and I have found myself caught up in all these weird threads about Dungeons and Dragons. And honestly, I know nothing about it, but I find people and their passions for Dungeons and Dragons absolutely intriguing. So, there you go. You've outed me. Lila, I'm going to miss you this summer. What am I going to do without my wicked stepsister? I'm putting a link to Lila's work in the show notes. Let's take a few minutes to answer the 4 questions that we look at for each of our themes. This, the theme of our passions. Number 1, what is working? Did you have an uninterrupted day to do something that you love? Who am I kidding? How about an uninterrupted hour? Is there an opportunity for you to take an activity from being a hobby to becoming a passion if you just have the courage to take a risk? How exciting! Enjoy the honeymoon phase with this new passion. Number 2, what isn't working? Does this talk of passions leave you feeling tepid? Are you having a hard time imagining the last time you did something you loved? Are you suffering terribly for want of time? Don't despair. Just be honest as you answer those questions. Number 3, what do I need to consider? If you are in a season of life where pleasure and passion is conspicuously absent, please consider getting professional mental health support. Or at least consider having a heart-to-heart conversation with somebody who can listen compassionately to you. Go back to those silvery threads we talked about earlier. Which of those would you be willing to go out of your comfort zone to reincorporate into your life? How could you do it? Or if you're faced with a lack of time to do what you love, consider how you use your time. Without standing in judgment as to how you use your time, consider the ways you might be wasting it on things that don't matter, or how you might channel some freed up moments into what you love. And number 4, what can you do today to get you closer to your ideal life in this area? Is there a phone call you need to make? Sign up for a class, or someone you need to contact to help you make a step forward. Do it today, and then celebrate that little tiny step forward. You are unique. You are special. You were created with an exquisite palette of talents and passions, a character and personality that qualify you to make an indelible mark on this world. I believe that you alone can make a difference by using the full palette in a way that only you can. Be willing to get out of your comfort zone for the things you love. The reward for daring to pursue your passions is a life of greater satisfaction, more moments of happiness. The philosopher princess loves to go on about how virtue is its own reward, yada, yada, yada. Well, I would like to add that passion is also its own reward. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on your podcatcher, and we will be back in September. So by subscribing, you will be reminded as soon as our next episode is posted. If you've enjoyed something you've heard here, please share it with someone you think could use a fairy godmother too. A great big thank you to 7 Productions here in Mulhouse, France for the use of the song La Joie as the intro and outro to the show. Also, thanks to Matt Kugler who sang it and to Claude Egwe who wrote it. We'll be back on September 1st to start examining the ideal life theme of marriage. In the meantime, lace up your dancing shoes, darling. It's time to start singing with your feet.